Most people think they are one technique away from changing their life. One more method, one more routine, one more secret. They collect affirmations, visualize harder, journal longer, meditate deeper, yet nothing moves. And they wonder why. The truth is simple and uncomfortable. Techniques do not create reality. You do. A technique is only a gesture. It has no power on its own. It is like knocking on a door while secretly believing no one will answer. The knock is not the problem. The belief is you don't need more techniques. You need a shift in who you are being. Creation does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you assume is already true. The moment you assume something as fact, not emotionally, not desperately, but calmly and naturally, life begins to organize itself around that assumption, not because you forced it, but because it could do nothing else. Effort is misunderstood. People think effort means commitment, but in truth, strain is evidence of doubt. When something is real to you, you don't strain to believe it. You simply live from it. You don't affirm that your name is your name. You don't visualize to convince yourself of it. You assume it, and the world agrees. This is the missing piece. Your life is not waiting for better techniques. It is waiting for you to decide. Decide who you are. Decide what is true now. Decide without negotiation with appearances. Because the outer world is not a problem to be solved. It is a reflection to be read. When you change your inner position, you don't fight circumstances. You watch them dissolve and rearrange. Doors open without force. People shift without persuasion. Opportunities appear without pursuit. And persistence is not repeating methods over and over again. Persistence is remaining loyal to your inner decision, even when nothing seems to move yet, especially then. You're not here to beg reality. You are here to occupy a state. And once you do, once you stop trying and start assuming, life has no choice but to follow. So, no, you don't need more techniques. You need this, a quiet, unwavering acceptance that what you choose to be is already done. And from that place, everything changes. Most people believe that creation is a mechanical process, that if they perform the right action in the right order, reality will reward them with results. This belief is why techniques have become so popular. They feel safe, they feel structured, they give the illusion of control. But techniques by themselves are empty gestures. They do not possess creative power, they only reflect the state of consciousness of the person using them. Two people can perform the exact same technique and receive entirely different outcomes, not because the technique works better for one than the other, but because each person occupies a different inner state while performing it. A state of being is the lens through which life is experienced and interpreted. It is not something you do, it is something you are. When someone lives in a state of lack, even their affirmations are spoken from hunger. Their visualizations are charged with wanting rather than knowing. Their actions are heavy with effort, and effort, no matter how disciplined, cannot override an inner assumption of absence. The world responds not to the words spoken or images imagined, but to the silent agreement you hold with yourself about what is possible, available, and true. Techniques often fail because they are used as attempts to change circumstances rather than expressions of inner conviction. When someone repeats affirmations while secretly checking reality for proof, they are confessing disbelief. When they visualize while waiting for emotional fireworks to validate the process, they are still seeking permission to believe. Creation does not respond to persuasion, it responds to a sump. The inner posture must shift first, or every method becomes another form of resistance. Being precedes having. This order is unbreakable. You cannot sustain an outcome that contradicts your self-concept. Even when results appear temporarily, they collapse if the inner state remains unchanged. This is why people manifest success only to lose it, love only to repeat the same patterns, or money only to feel unsafe again. The state was never embodied, it was borrowed for a moment through effort. When the state changes, techniques become unnecessary, though they may still be used naturally and effortlessly. They stop being tools of force and become expressions of identity. A person who assumes abundance does not affirm to become abundant. Their thoughts, reactions, and expectations already move in that direction without strain. Reality mirrors this coherence faithfully. The real work is internal alignment, not constant action. It is choosing an inner position and living from it so. Consistently, that doubt no longer has a seat at the table. Once this happens, the outer world rearranges without struggle, because it always follows the state you occupy, never the techniques you perform. Most people treat imagination as a secondary activity, something ornamental or optional, useful only for creativity or entertainment. They see it as a tool they occasionally pick up, apply for a few minutes, and then set aside while returning to what they call the real world. But imagination is not separate from reality, nor is it a method that operates only when deliberately engaged. It is the very medium through which reality is experienced and shaped. Every perception, expectation, fear, and desire arises first within imagination, long before it ever appears as an external fact. What you consistently imagine, whether consciously or unconsciously, becomes the framework through which life unfolds. This is not about fantasy or escapism. It is about assumption. Imagination is the place where assumptions are formed and rehearsed. When you imagine a future outcome, you are not previewing a possibility, you are selecting a version of yourself who already lives in alignment with that outcome. The moment that inner selection is accepted as natural, the outer world begins to echo it. The misunderstanding comes when people try to use imagination as a mechanical exercise rather than a living experience. They visualize scenes but remain emotionally anchored to their current limitations. They imagine success while internally identifying as someone still striving for it. In such cases, imagination becomes divided against itself. One part plays the image, while the other part maintains the old identity. The world responds to the dominant assumption, not the temporary image. Imagination works best when it is quiet, relaxed, and unforced. It does not require vivid pictures or intense emotion. It requires acceptance. The simplest imaginal act, when believed, outweighs hours of strained visualization. When something feels natural in imagination, it begins to feel inevitable in life. This is why daydreams repeated without resistance often materialize, while disciplined visualizations performed with effort do not. Imagination is also operating when you are worried, replaying conversations, or anticipating disappointment. These imaginal acts are just as creative as intentional ones. The difference is awareness. Most people imagine unconsciously and then wonder why life keeps repeating the same patterns. They do not realize that imagination never stops creating, regardless of intention. To understand imagination as creative power is to take responsibility for inner life without fear or obsession. It is not about policing every thought, but about gently returning to the assumption you choose to live from. When imagination is aligned with identity, it becomes effortless. Thoughts naturally flow in the direction of what is assumed to be true. Imagination is not something you use to change the world. It is the place where the world is first agreed upon. Change the agreement, and reality has no option but to follow. Effort is often praised as a virtue, but in the realm of inner creation, effort is frequently misunderstood. Most people equate effort with discipline, commitment, or seriousness. Yet the kind of effort that involves strain, force, and emotional pressure is a clear signal of misalignment. When something is truly accepted as real within, there is no tension around it. You do not grip it, chase it, or try to hold it in place. You simply live from it. Strain only appears when the inner state and the desired outcome are not yet reconciled, when someone is forcing themselves to believe, repeating statements through clenched teeth, or constantly correcting their thoughts out of fear. They are not aligned with the state they want to experience. They are negotiating with doubt rather than dissolving it. This inner struggle reveals an underlying assumption that the desired reality is distant or difficult to reach. The more effort is applied, the more that assumption is reinforced. Life does not respond to struggle as proof of worthiness, it responds to inner ease as proof of acceptance. Effort usually arises from the belief that reality must be persuaded or controlled. People try to make things happen by intensity, longer routines, stronger emotions, more repetition. But intensity is not power. Acceptance is. A state that feels natural requires no maintenance. It sustains itself without vigilance. When you know something is yours, you do not work to keep believing it. You simply expect it to be reflected. Misalignment is also revealed in urgency. The need to see immediate results, to check for signs, or to measure progress is not persistence, it is anxiety. Anxiety signals that the inner state has not yet stabilized. When alignment is present, time loses its emotional charge. Waiting does not feel like waiting, it feels like movement is already underway, even if nothing is visible yet. Effort also shows up as overcorrection. People monitor every thought, fearing that a single negative idea will undo everything. This creates mental rigidity and exhaustion. Alignment is fluid, not brittle. It allows thoughts to pass without panic because the underlying assumption remains untouched. One negative moment does not threaten a deeply accepted state, just as one cloudy day does not convince you the sea. Climate has changed. True alignment feels ordinary. It lacks drama. It often feels almost boring compared to the emotional highs of forced techniques. This is why many people abandon it. They mistake calm certainty for lack of progress. But calm is the signal that the inner work is done. When effort falls away, manifestation begins to move freely. Strain is not a requirement, it is feedback. It tells you that you are trying to produce an outcome without fully becoming the version of yourself who expects it. The moment you stop pushing and allow the state to settle, life responds with the same ease you finally allowed yourself to feel. Everything that appears in a person's life flows from the idea they hold about who they are. This idea is often unexamined, yet it quietly governs choices, reactions, expectations, and limits. Identity is not defined by circumstances. Circumstances are shaped by identity. What you repeatedly experience is not evidence of fate or chance, but confirmation of the role you have accepted as yourself. Before any result can appear and remain, the inner definition must already be in place. People often try to change outcomes without touching identity. They seek new relationships while still seeing themselves as unwanted, pursue wealth while identifying as someone who struggles, or aim for peace while internally rehearsing conflict. In these cases, results may briefly show up, but they feel fragile and temporary. The inner identity eventually reasserts itself, pulling reality back into familiar patterns. Life is not punishing them, it is simply loyal to the self-concept they continue to occupy. Identity operates through assumption rather than effort. You do not need to convince yourself of who you are when it feels natural. You simply act, think, and respond from that place automatically. This is why identity is so powerful. It shapes behavior without conscious control. A person who identifies as confident does not remind themselves to be company. Confident. Their posture, voice, and decisions reflect it without deliberation. In the same way, a person who identifies with lack or struggle does not choose those outcomes deliberately. They emerge as the most natural expression of who they believe themselves to be. Changing identity does not mean denying present circumstances or pretending they do not exist. It means refusing to let them define you. Circumstances are effects, not causes. When identity shifts, perception shifts, and with it interpretation and response. Opportunities that were previously invisible suddenly appear. Interactions change tone. What once felt impossible begins to feel normal, not because the world changed first, but because the inner reference point did. The challenge is that identity change often feels like loss. Letting go of an old self can feel unfamiliar, even unsafe, because it removes the predictability of past patterns. People cling to old identities not because they enjoy the results, but because they know how to survive within them. Stepping into a new identity requires a quiet decision to accept unfamiliar ease, unfamiliar success, unfamiliar peace. Results follow identity because identity determines what feels allowable. You do not receive what contradicts your sense of self for long. When something aligns with identity, it feels deserved, expected, and sustainable. When it does not, it feels accidental or unstable. This is why identity must be addressed before chasing outcomes. Once the inner definition changes, results no longer need to be pursued. They arrive as confirmations of who you have already decided to be. Most people believe persistence means doing something over and over again until reality finally gives in. They repeat affirmations, visualize daily, journal endlessly, and measure their dedication by how many times they perform a method.
But repetition of technique is not persistence. It is often a disguise for doubt.
True persistence has nothing to do with how many times you perform an exercise and everything to do with how steadily you remain loyal to a single inner assumption. When you decide something is true about yourself or your life, that decision begins a quiet movement within consciousness. Persistence is the willingness to stay with that decision even when the outer world offers no immediate confirmation, not by forcing belief, not by arguing with yourself, but by continuing to live as though the inner choice has already been made. It is not an act of willpower, it is an act of allegiance. Repetition becomes unnecessary when assumption feels natural. You do not repeatedly remind yourself that the sky is blue. You do not rehearse the fact that your name belongs to you. These are assumptions that require no maintenance. In the same way, when an inner state is truly accepted, it sustains itself without constant reinforcement. Techniques may still be used, but they are no longer desperate attempts to change reality. They become gentle reminders of a position already held. Many people exhaust themselves cycling through methods because they are secretly searching for something to make them believe. They hope the right technique will generate certainty. But certainty does not come from techniques. It comes from decision. A single clear inner choice, held steadily, outweighs years of mechanical practice. Persistence in assumption means that when doubts arise, you do not wrestle with them. You do not try to crush them or replace them with frantic positivity. You simply return to the chosen state as the most reasonable interpretation of your experience. Doubt becomes background noise rather than a command. It also means refusing to let temporary appearances redefine your inner position. The outer world is delayed feedback. It reflects who you were being, not who you are choosing to be now. If you allow current circumstances to dictate your assumption, you are constantly living from the past. Persistence is remain, anchored in the new identity while the old echoes are still fading. This form of persistence feels calm. It lacks urgency. There is no inner countdown, no emotional bargaining, no constant checking for signs. There is an underlying sense that movement is inevitable because the state is already selected. Time becomes irrelevant because fulfillment is experienced internally before it is seen externally. Persistence in assumption is not about holding a mental image all day. It is about occupying a standpoint. From that standpoint, your thoughts, expectations, and reactions naturally reorganize. You begin to interpret events differently. You respond differently. You choose differently. Without effort, your life starts to reflect the shift. One inner decision, faithfully lived in, quietly reshapes everything. Most people approach life as if it were an opponent. They see problems as enemies, obstacles as punishments, and unwanted situations as things to be fought, fixed, or defeat. This mindset turns existence into a constant struggle. Every challenge becomes a battle, every delay an injustice, every undesirable circumstance a personal failure. Yet this entire approach is built on a misunderstanding of what the world actually is. The outer world is not an independent force acting upon you. It is a reflection responding to you, not to your words, not to your rituals, not even to your conscious intentions, but to your dominant inner assumptions about yourself and about life. What you see is feedback. It is information, not opposition. When you treat circumstances as enemies, you grant them power. You react emotionally, argue with what is, and attempt to overpower appearances through force or effort. But fighting a reflection never changes the source. You can shout at a mirror all day, but the image will not change unless you change what is standing in front of it. The moment you understand that the world is a mirror, your relationship with life shifts. Instead of asking, "How do I fix this?" you begin to ask, "What within me is being expressed?" This is not self-blame, it is self-ownership. It is the recognition that you are not a victim of conditions, but the point from which conditions emerge. Unwanted circumstances are not punishments, they are indicators. They reveal the state you have been occupying, often unconsciously. If relationships repeatedly disappoint, it is not because people are untrustworthy. If money feels unstable, it is not because opportunities are scarce. If life feels heavy, it is not because existence is cruel. These experiences are mirrors reflecting inner definitions that have not yet been questioned. A mirror does not judge what it reflects, it simply shows it. In the same way, the world is neutral. It has no agenda. It does not reward or punish. It obeys. When you shift your inner position, the reflection must shift as well, not through force, but through alignment. Seeing the world as a mirror removes the need to fight. You no longer waste energy trying to control people, manipulate outcomes, or overpower circumstances. You focus inward, where real causation occurs. This does not make you passive, it makes you precise. You place your attention where it actually matters. Growth, then, is not about conquering external challenges. It is about outgrowing the inner states that produce them. When you no longer occupy the state that matches a particular problem, that problem cannot remain. It either transforms or disappears. This understanding also brings compassion. You stop condemning yourself for past experiences because you recognize that you were simply expressing a state you did not yet know how to change. And you stop fearing future problems because you know they are not random ambushes, but reflections you have the power to alter at the source. You do not battle mirrors. You change what saint stands before them, and the reflection always follows.